Welcome. Each week I go through the published information about the COVID-19 pandemic and do a statistical analysis to see if I can make sense of what is going on. And I'm finding that more and more difficult as time goes by. This particular video covers the week ending the 18th of July 2020. And I've subtitled this particular video, Two 747s crashed yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that, and so on back to March 1st. That's how bad it's getting with the COVID-19 pandemic. The main takeaway points from this video are going to be that the US is getting over 70,000 cases in a day now. The number of deaths in the US are on the rise, despite what some politicians are claiming. In the midst of this pandemic getting so bad, Trump is proposing cuts to COVID-related funding. The world is in recession, with the exception of one economy. China's economy is now back in growth mode. And that's because it took extreme measures very early on in this process. Let's take a look at the situation as far as the world pandemic is concerned. This graph shows the number of cases as a function of time with the red line. You can see we have now over 14 million cases. Back in March and April, there was a fairly uniform increase in the rate of cases. And you can see it with this extended line that I've got here. However, you can see that the curve has actually deviated to the left of that, and that means that the number of cases is exponentially increasing. And if we project forward where we are now, you see that these two lines continue to diverge. We need to turn that upper line over to the right until it flattens out, which is going to still take quite some time. In the background we have the number of daily cases, and you see they've been steadily on the rise, and we reached a record of nearly 250,000 just yesterday. The overall numbers are that we're at 14.1 million confirmed cases globally, and we passed 600,000 deaths. The rates, we are getting something like 240,000 new cases a day at the moment, and about 500 deaths per day. Let's take a look at the 10 worst performing countries as far as the number of cases are concerned. The US leads the list, with Brazil and India close behind. There are 5 countries here with double-digit increases in their numbers of cases. That's the United States, Brazil, India, South Africa and Mexico. There are 4 countries here with Russia, Peru, Chile and Iran with single-digit increases, which is still not very good. And the only country that seems to be managing things at the moment, at least, is the UK. That's at 2%, and in fact it would have been lower than that, but they redefined their death rate, or they updated their death rate this week, and if they hadn't done that, this number would be less than 1%. I've also added a column here on mortality, percentage of mortality, and the average is around about 5 or 6%. But 2 countries are particularly outstanding here, with Mexico at 11% and the UK at 15%, and that is just an amazingly high number, and I have no reason why that is the case. Let's take a look at how this virus is spreading around the globe. The darker the red color here, the more infections there are. You can see that the United States, Brazil and India are leading the way, with South Africa, Russia and a few other countries in South America not far behind. This is the equivalent map for the United States, and you can see that the main problem areas are in the southeast, along the Gulf Coast and into Southern California. Now this is particularly worrisome because these are the hot states, and remember, the high temperature summer was supposed to be tamping this particular pandemic down, and it shows no sign of doing so. The overall numbers are we have 3.7 million cases in the United States, which represents 26% of the world's total, and that is actually for a population that represents 4% of the world's total. We have 141,000 deaths, that's 24% of the world's totals. The rate at the moment, we're up to nearly 70,000 cases per day, and about 1,000 deaths per day. This graph shows the number of cases as a function of time for the United States. And as you can see, initially, at least through May and June, we were beginning to turn this curve over, as we indeed hoped. But by mid-June and now through July, that curve has started to accelerate upwards again. In fact, the little red circle up there is where we are currently. This graph is a few days behind schedule. This graph shows the number of cases as a function of time for the 9 worst affected states, all of those with numbers of cases over 100,000. And you'll notice that 5 of them, Georgia, Arizona, Texas, Florida and California, are rising very rapidly, and that's a great concern. There are 11 states with greater than 50,000 cases, and the disturbing thing about this is that all of them are now beginning to show signs of rising, and will be joining their friends at over 100,000 fairly soon by the look of it. The US death rate is starting to increase once again. Dr. Fauci says that the number of new cases could reach up to 100,000 a day in the US. We're already at over 70,000, so that's not such a far-fetched prediction. The CDC is predicting between 150 and 190,000 deaths by the end of August. Now that was unthinkable a few months ago, but now it seems to be quite well within the realms of possibility. For several months we had a slowly decreasing death rate, as you can see here from this dotted line. However, for the last 3 weeks the trend has been in the opposite direction, reaching something like 1,000 cases per day. Now that is equivalent not to one 747 crashing each day, but 2 747s crashing each day ever since the 1st of March. Now we know what fuss there was over those 2 Boeing airplanes that crashed within 6 months of one another. And those planes, thank goodness, are no longer flying. However, if we had 2 of those planes crashing every day, there'd be an almighty uproar. But our administration does not seem to be taking this particularly seriously. Interestingly, I've not seen an accounting of how much the actual medical cost of this pandemic is costing us so far. So I've done a few sums here and estimate that overall it would be costing us about $60 billion so far. That's based on about 500,000 hospitalizations, a usage of the ICU unit at a rate of about $7,000 to $11,000 per day. That would cost $25 billion. Remdesivir courses cost about $3,000, and you multiply that up by the number of patients that are seriously ill, and that comes to another $10 billion. And we've invested at least $2 billion in vaccine development. Let's take a look at some other economic losses. One simple one is the cost of all the funerals that we're going to have. There is over 140,000 deaths to account for so far, and the average cost of a funeral in the United States is between $7,000 to $12,000. If you add that up, that comes to about another $1.5 billion so far. The global GDP is $142 trillion. The US share of that is about $21 trillion. Economists are estimating that the global economy will likely lose about $22 trillion, and the US will lose about $3 trillion off of its GDP. Then of course we have all the problems with the states. Because of the shutdowns, etc., they've had a shortfall in their tax revenues, and they've managed to accrue a lot of extra expenses to help deal with this pandemic. So they're going to have budgetary problems for years to come. It seems much of the world is in recession. The areas here in brown show the areas that have had the worst economic dropback so far. Most of the areas in grey we just don't have the data for, so we can't actually tell what they're doing. There's only one economy that is known so far to be back into growth, and that's China. They, because they shut down so completely and so quickly, and knock the level of infections down to very, very low levels. They're only getting 1 or 2 cases a day at the moment. They can afford to reopen their economy completely, and so have sprung back into growth. If you have to travel, and I would strongly advise against it unless it's absolutely necessary, the CDC has issued the following guidelines for safe travel or safer travel. Ensure that wherever you're going there's protective screens for you, that they've enhanced their cleaning regime for planes and trains and such like, that hand sanitizers are available. You need to maintain social distancing at least 6 foot and wear a mask. Check in online, pre-order currencies, pre-book parking, and also pre-book public transport. That way that minimizes the number of interactions you have with various officials. So until next time, stay safe and goodbye.